Hey everybody, welcome to today's live. It's going to be a Q&A at the end, and we'll be focusing our conversation on mold mycotoxins and how they may be triggering skin, gut, and dental issues in your child. To help us understand and unpack this topic, we're joined by Deidre Bloomquist, visionary functional nutritionist and founder of Always Growing Wellness. Deidre is dedicated to unraveling the complex relationship between environmental toxins, fertility, and childhood health. She empowers individuals to enhance fertility, achieve healthier pregnancies, and nurture thriving future generations. Her pediatric practice specializes in supporting gut health and eczema by screening for toxic burden. Her virtual practice supports clients across the United States to restore health by bringing our bodies back to their natural capacity. She's also the best-selling author of Toxic Infertility, Detoxification Solutions to Improve Natural Fertility. Welcome, Deidre. We're thrilled to have you.
I'm so excited to be here and go talking about this today.
The whole genesis of Deidre being with us is that she wrote an article for our sister site, Sinusitis Wellness, and we'll put the link to the article in the caption. But I thought we could kind of start by going through the case study that you wrote about in the article and how you helped that patient and kind of how you came to the conclusion that mycotoxins were a big part of the issue.
Yeah. So we work with a lot of kids who have some level of gut dysfunction, and especially where there's eczema. And this little boy came in after his parents had been watching their son struggle for a number of months. He was about 1, and around the time he was born, they started to notice that there were small rashes on his cheeks, and they started to slowly turn into a full body flare after he had just a normal cold. And they were trying to do all the right things. His mom was doing an elimination diet. She was removing more and more foods from her diet and his diet as she started to introduce foods. But she was really nervous about introducing foods because it just seemed like he was reactive to everything. And she had tried every lotion on the market, whether it was natural or conventional. And he was just really still struggling at the end of the day. He had very bright and irritated skin. It was worse after they took baths, and he was just so itchy. And the one thing that we often find with kids who are really itchy is that they don't sleep well. And when our babies aren't sleeping well, nobody's sleeping well. So that was their big concern, is like, how can we help him be less itchy first and foremost? But when we started digging into things more, we found that he was also constipated. He was not having a bowel movement on a daily basis, is what that means in my book. And he was having a lot of sensory seeking behavior. So he was crashing around and banging his head and having really big emotional outbursts, especially in the form of rage in particular, which is not necessarily a bad thing for 1-year-olds by any means, but mom just felt like it wasn't normal and that there was something else happening. So those were her big concerns. But then it came to the point where he was starting to get his baby teeth. They were starting to come in, and she was noticing signs of decay as they came in. And she had never given him sugar, and she was just totally shocked. And that was kind of the final straw of, we have got to figure out what's going on in this little boy's body, because if we don't, there's going to be huge health implications. We're thinking about big dental procedures and removing teeth and thinking long-term about, like, is he going to live like this forever ultimately?
Oh, wow. Okay. So where do you begin with testing, especially with like a child? Because I know moms especially are worried about how invasive that's going to be and discomfort and things like that. So
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 tests that I like to run on all of the kids that we work with. The first is a GI map stool test. And this is a single stool sample collection, and it's going to look at beneficial bacteria in the gut, so all of the good stuff in the garden, but it's also going to look at all of the weeds of the garden. So this is going to be opportunistic bacteria, yeast, and parasites. But the nice thing about this test, and why I like this from a non-invasive perspective, is it also tells us about liver function and the immune system. So it can tell us if the liver is producing adequate bile to be breaking down fatty acids, or if we're seeing some of that in the stool. And it tells us about a certain detoxification pathway that is commonly impacted by things like mold or elevated bacteria levels in the liver as well. So we can tell if we need to support the liver a little extra. But it also tells us about things like calprotectin, which is basically the gold standard when it comes to inflammation in the GI tract as well. So that tells us more about what's happening in the child's gut in particular. So in this case, he was having constipation. And we know that when children are being exposed to foods and they're sensitive and maybe they're being diagnosed with food allergies, for instance, we're thinking about some level of leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And oftentimes the approach is remove food. But what parents often find is now they're reactive to more and more foods over time. And so the way that I usually explain this is that food sensitivities and sometimes food allergies can be part of this permeability in the gut. And so the problem isn't the food. While the food can be a trigger, the real issue is what's causing the inflammation in the GI tract. And that's going to be the pathogens that we can detect on the GI map. But the second test that we run on all of our kids is a total tox test from Vibrant America. And this test is a urine test. So again, non-invasive. Kids don't have to be potty trained to do this. The way that we do it for babies who are in diapers still is we will have them put cotton balls in the diaper and then we just squeeze the urine into the test tube. So it's super easy for parents to collect that sample. But that test screens for mycotoxins, which come from mold. And this is really what we're looking at with the total tox. That's our primary concern. But it also screens for heavy metals as well as industrial chemicals. So think personal care chemicals from like your lotions, things like that, but it's also going to be pesticides and plastics. And the reason we want to have an idea of what's happening with heavy metals as well as industrial chemicals is those are going to tell us about anything else that is also burdening the liver. This can be really important when we're thinking about supporting liver function in kids because it's not uncommon that we'll see patterns where certain pathways in the liver are struggling, but others are doing okay. So we want to make sure that we're supporting what each child uniquely needs. But we also know that heavy metals can feed things like candida in the GI tract. And so having a good idea of what's happening from a heavy metal burden perspective ensures that we can support that aspect as well. So while there may be something like mold or a candida issue in the GI tract that's contributing to that overall inflammation and immune dysregulation, we need to be able to address everything so that we make sure that this doesn't come back in the future as well.
Okay. So with this particular patient, what did you find as far as what stood out that was being the great disruptor?
Yeah. So this little boy had a good amount of mycotoxins. He had 16 different mycotoxins that were detected on his total tox test. So
Okay.
that's a pretty good amount all in all. He did also have a number of different heavy metals and industrial chemicals, but they were not nearly as significant as his mycotoxins. And he not only had mycotoxins, but he had a lot that were the very dangerous variety that came from water damaged homes, for instance, as well as like contaminated food, think like grains, coffee, dairy, things like that. And so he had a very high burden. And so we were thinking about this as the primary contributing factor to what we were seeing impact his liver and then creating a susceptibility for more pathogens to start to overgrow in his GI tract. So, we saw a good amount of bacteria, both good and bad, overgrowing, but then also knew that we needed to address what was causing those bacterial overgrowths as well.
Okay. So when that pops up, and in this case, and you in your article you stated in this case that you were able to rule out that the current home was not the problem, but this kind of leads me to a question in that would your next step be or was it with this mom to say you need to do some environmental testing? Okay.
Yep. So anytime we see water damage based mycotoxins on testing, the first step is always testing the home. And that's the only objective way to know if there is something currently happening in the environment, ultimately. So when we do that, we're thinking about a number of different testing options depending on budget, willingness of the family, whatever makes sense for them. So for instance, one of the easiest ways that we can have parents test if they're, not really convinced or sure that there's something they need to look into. One option would be to do the microbalance plate testing. That's a really great way to do that. We often recommend that. It's very low cost. It's easy for them to do. We can have them check different rooms, especially if they're suspicious about certain rooms in the home that they think there could be something. And then from there, they can certainly go up in terms of not only price point, but then just a different type of testing ultimately to do more dust sample collection. So something like an ERMI or an EMA or a dust test are very similar generally to figure out if there is a mold burden, like more of a fungal count and mycotoxins being excreted into the air. But the only way to know ultimately is to test the home. And I know this is something where, we'll talk to a lot of families. There was one family that we've been working with actually who lives in Arizona, and they live in the middle of the desert. And they're like, there's no way I have mold in my home because like it's so dry and like, we don't have any known water damage. Well, they tested their home and they actually had Stachybotrys in their home, which is black mold. And this is not uncommon. So I think the big thing is to understand that mold grows in all climates. All it requires is water and darkness in order to thrive. And that is ultimately present in all homes throughout the US. Of course, there are greater susceptibilities in environments where it's like more humid and like more prone to water damage, lots of rain, things like that. But it really can be anywhere. It's not always a musty smell. And so testing is really the only objective way to know if there was damage in the home. And that's what this family did. So they did testing. We didn't find anything out of the ordinary that connected back to what we were seeing on this little boy's toxin test. And so we were ultimately able to decide this was probably a transfer in utero, which is not uncommon, where we'll see moms in particular who say, when I was pregnant, we were living in a home, but we have since moved where I know that there was mold, or I grew up in a home where there was mold, or I went I lived in a sorority or a dormitory or a home when I was younger where I know that there was probably mold, but I didn't realize it was going to impact my kids now.
And that kind of leads me to another question, and this wasn't in your article, but it kind of interested me. So for this little boy, he was, I forget how old you said he was.
He's one.
One. Okay. So if the mother is still breastfeeding at this point, do you also have her do a urine test just to see if there's still some kind of transfer, or at this point, is that not as important?
Yeah, great question. And this is a question we get a lot, especially for breastfed children, where moms are often concerned that if they are transferring something, that it's creating more harm than good.
Yeah.
And like, do I need to stop? Does that make sense? And the same comes up with like food sensitivities as well, ultimately. So we do know that mycotoxins can be transferred via breast milk. Breast milk is ultimately a drainage pathway in the body. And this is why it's very important that women are very careful about what they're consuming and taking as far as like supplements or medications when they are breastfeeding, because it can transfer. The way that we approach this is we don't typically recommend testing on mom. And the only reason we do that is because it is stressful. If we see that there are mycotoxins for mom, it can be very stressful to feel inclined like you should stop. And what we know about breast milk is it is so nutrient dense. It changes with baby over time, and it's incredibly helpful from an immune perspective. And so many children who are struggling with mycotoxin illness already have a lot of immune struggles. So from our perspective, it makes sense to keep breastfeeding in place until either mom or baby are ready to discontinue for their own personal reasons, while we work on the inner terrain of the child. And what we find is that we can do this successfully to help that child rebalance everything, even while they continue to breastfeed. That breastfeeding does not need to discontinue. And then once mom's done breastfeeding, obviously thinking about maybe I did transfer things in utero, especially if they're considering continuing to grow their family, to try to do some level of detoxification in that gap between conception.
Okay. That's great. That's great advice. I love that, because mom guilt is so real.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a mycotoxin issue, you're already sort of dealing with that trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happened to me, actually. This is how I figured out my little boy's eczema. Is I figured out that I had been exposed to mold. I transferred it to him. It wasn't in our current home, and I was breastfeeding at the time. And everyone just told me, you should probably stop. And I just felt like there had to be a better way in terms of figuring out what was happening with his food sensitivities, and then being able to actually support rebalancing his gut, detoxing him from the toxins that I had unintentionally given to him, but it didn't mean that our breastfeeding journey had to end.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also something so powerful about that, mother to child and the bonding and the soothing, that especially if the child's sick, you don't want to remove that in the middle of everything. So
right. Absolutely.
Okay, so in the case of the article you wrote, the environment wasn't problematic, so you could move on to treatment. But in the case where you find that the environment is problematic, how do you approach that? Do you, do you kind of, it's, I mean, I know it can be hard because you don't want to withhold treatment, especially from a child that needs it.
Right. Right.
But I don't know. I was just kind of wondering how you kind of go about dealing with that.
Yeah. So I would say all kids are different in the way that they need to approach this ultimately. So ideally what happens is we can get some level of support in place no matter what. That means that we're supporting organ systems like the liver and the kidneys, which are our primary detoxification organs. These get the biggest burden from mycotoxins. If children are constipated, it also means we can support that the bowels to make sure that we're actually eliminating things so they're not recirculating on a regular basis. So we can focus on those areas, potentially bringing in something that's a very gentle binder to start mopping up and making sure that we're not getting worse. And for a lot of kids, even those levels of support make a huge difference in the symptoms that they're experiencing. So if we can get those in place, and let's say there's a family who knows that they need to have inspection or potentially remediation, and they're waiting for those things to happen because these things just take time. They're not a quick process as ever. We can have those things in place, which make sure that the child is stable, if not improving. Mm-hmm. And then some kids can continue to move forward in their protocol. But the point where we really don't want to be poking the bear basically is bringing in something that's antifungal in nature, where we're actually going in and eradicating any fungus in the body. If we do that while there is still an exposure, it just makes it very difficult. And ultimately, in my experience doing that, what happens is parents feel like they're just running on a hamster wheel where their kids are getting better, but they're like not fully getting better. And it just feels like a waste of time and energy and money and everything. And so if we can get to a certain point where we're either out of the environment or we've done the bulk of the remediation, even just removing the actual mold source, because I think when we think about remediation, it's this big umbrella term where we're talking about removing mold, but also cleaning the environment. If we can start to get some of that mitigation in place, remove the mold source, reduce what we're breathing in or what the child's breathing in, that means we can start to move forward. Some kids can go through antifungals, even if we just have some of those key pieces in place to start with. And some kids fully do need to get outside of the environment without any exposure from personal items in it. But ideally, getting out of the environment, doing remediation before we get to that final phase where we're really addressing all of the mold is really important.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And, I probably as the treatment progresses, and they see their child improving, they get more on board with whatever needs to be done or, being able to figure it out financially.
Yep.
Okay, so in the article, you sort of break things down for this case study, symptom by symptom, starting with the gut, then the skin, teeth and behavior, and cognitive. But I wanted everyone joining to know that we found you on Instagram, and you should definitely follow her if you're not already, if this topic interests you. It's always growing _littles, right, on Instagram?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But Deidre wrote a post about teeth and childhood teeth. And this is a little bit of it, and then we can kind of go into this. But in her post, she says, you can supplement with minerals all you want, but if you don't remove the mycotoxins that are depleting the minerals in the first place, your little may never get ahead on dental enamel health. So do you want to kind of talk about how you resolve that when mycotoxins are at play?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about dental health and the role of mycotoxins is that teeth are ultimately bones. And so they are influenced, the enamel in particular is influenced by bone remodeling. And we know that mycotoxins impact bone health and therefore the remodeling. And remodeling is basically the breakdown and the build up of bones, essentially. And so it's not uncommon where there is a mycotoxin exposure that we will see poor bone health in some capacity. And one of the first ways we often see this with kids is via dental health, where they will have teeth that are coming in decayed, or they will have early tooth decay when they're under 4 years old, even if the diet, it looks great. There's not a ton of sugar. We're brushing teeth. We're doing all the right things from a more conventional perspective, but we're missing this mycotoxin piece. And what mycotoxins do is they actually displace a lot of minerals in the body, like calcium and magnesium, and they deplete these in the way that they put stress on the body. And these are obviously critically important when it comes to bone health and therefore dental health. So when we're thinking about minerals, minerals are great, and we do need to replenish these at some point in time. But very similar to other nutrients, if we don't figure out what is causing those levels to be low in the first place, you have to supplement forever, right? And that's not really the goal, especially when we're thinking about young children. So instead, when we look at mycotoxins, if we can figure out if there is a burden there, start to detox those, use selective binders that are going to go in specific to the mycotoxins that each child has. Consider if there's a colonization issue in their body. So colonization is when fungus from mold starts to grow in the body, primarily in the sinuses and the GI tract in the form of something like candida. We have to address these things to make sure that, kids who have been exposed to a moldy home or building, they then have the fungus living in them that produces the mycotoxins. They become the moldy building where they're producing the toxins from the inside out. And so we have to address both components of those, remove those, and then bring minerals in to rebalance things. When we do it in that strategic order, it means that dental enamel can actually start to remodel and rebuild. And of course, still keeping those other healthy lifestyle factors in place. Doing dental health, monitoring those things, working with somebody like a biological dentist to determine at what severity your child is in terms of like, do we need to remove teeth? Are we thinking about filling these things? But I think a lot of times we're really only thinking about the mineral side and putting those things into the diet, and they are crucial, but we're missing the piece that's depleting them in the first place.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. I know that dental health was, even for me, suffered when we were living in a moldy home, which was one of the biggest surprises of the whole mycotoxin journey. But okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so speaking of binders, do you have sort of, I don't mean to put you on the spot about this because I know that binders are specific to the toxin, but is there a gentle binder that is a good place to start for most parents?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Cellcore's carbon-based binders. They are fairly broad spectrum in that they do work on a number of different mycotoxins. So my favorite one for them for children is biotoxin binder. It's incredibly gentle. It's not only a carbon-based binder. So that's my one big caveat, is to take a look at the ingredients, because there are some other ingredients in that binder. But that tends to work well for a lot of kids. The reason why I like that binder over something like an activated charcoal is that it's a selective binder, where traditional binders like charcoal can bind to minerals in particular, which is why they're often recommended to be taken away from food, which is sometimes tricky with kids because they just snack all the time and they're constantly eating. It's not like adults where we have set meals throughout the day always. And so I find, especially with younger children, a binder that's selective and not going to be depleting minerals further, especially if they do have skin health issues or they have dental concerns where we're thinking about cavities and already concerned about mineral levels or nutrient status being low. These selective binders are a great option just to make sure that we're not making an existing problem worse.
Okay, that's really helpful. What about things like fulvic acid? Are those okay for children?
Yes, I love fulvic acid. Biofulvic is one of the top things that we bring in. Anything that contains fulvic acid is a really gentle binder, but it's also a very gentle biofilm disruptor. So one of the things we know about mold and fungus, and this is true of all pathogens, is that they produce biofilm, which essentially protects them, but it also makes them harder to be taken care of by our immune system. Mm-hmm. And so if we can start to break down those biofilms, it just means our immune system can help us go in and do that work as well.
Okay. Well, and I know something that you and Microbalance are very aligned with is the need to address the nose, whether it be in the adults or the kids living in the home. And just kind of at what point do you bring that in? Is that something that you look for sinus symptoms to bring in, or is it just something that you address whether the parent is aware of sinus symptoms or not?
Yeah. So we're usually screening our kids for sinus symptoms. So if they have runny nose, they have congestion, they have kind of weird tics where they're like rubbing their nose a lot, even if you're not seeing any runny nose. If they seem like they have like a postnasal drip, sometimes can be a sign of a sinus issue. Or if they're sneezing a lot, right? That's our body's natural way of trying to expel things. Or they have respiratory issues where they have things like asthma or trouble breathing, or they feel like shortness of breath. Those are the times when we are absolutely always bringing in some sinus support. And we know that the sinuses are one of the primary ways that gets colonized when kids are exposed to mold in the home. And so we want to make sure that if we're doing all the right things to bring in a detoxification protocol, that we're not missing a key component. And while antifungals can be systemic, they are primarily working on the GI tract ultimately. And so we want to bring in some level of sinus support in an antifungal fashion to make sure that we're addressing the sinuses as well. But if we know that the child has been exposed in a current environment and they don't have any symptoms, it's still important to bring in sinus support. Some kids handle things incredibly well and don't have a lot of symptoms. But the thing when we're writing protocols for kids, we really want our practice to be their last stop. We see a lot of kids who have seen a lot of providers, done everything, spent a lot of money working with things, trying to figure out what's going on. And we just want to make sure that nothing comes back in the future. We know that the sinuses and ultimately the oral cavity can repopulate the GI tract. So it's always worth addressing, or at least considering. We love the citrus spray. It helps in a huge way. It's very gentle. We can use it with kids. It's just, got to put up some guidelines in terms of like what to watch for as far as things like bloody noses and things like that. But most kids tolerate it incredibly well. So it's usually worth considering.
Yeah. I mean, even something as simple as like a saline spray sometimes can be very helpful for a little person.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. We can probably move on to questions in just a second. But I was wondering about, you see a lot of eczema in your practice, and I was hoping that maybe you could explain to people why there is that really unique eczema mold exposure connection. So if your little one is kind of having that issue, why you might want to dig and environmentally. Okay,
absolutely.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So we do see a lot of fungal eczema, particularly in our practice. And so the thing to keep in mind with mold is that it impacts a lot of different systems in the body. The first one being the liver. And we know that anytime you're seeing skin issues, the liver is being impacted to some capacity. It's just different severities for everybody. And so anytime the liver is being impacted, it just means that everything that our children are coming in contact with, the things they touch, they put in their mouth, they're eating, all of that also needs to be processed through the liver, as well as everything that their body's producing. So think essentially like the trash from cell production and like what cells are doing on a regular basis. Hormones, that all needs to go through the liver as well. And this is true for kids. And so if the liver is struggling, often what happens is the body will be pulling the emergency brake to push things out of another form as kind of a last ditch effort if it cannot go via the bowels and the kidney or the liver is struggling. And that comes out through the skin. And what we find with fungal eczema in particular is that it has a very distinct look to it. And it means that a lot of traditional eczema supports just don't work at the end of the day. So they have really bad redness that flares. They get worse with heat or water contact. So a lot of people will notice they get so much worse after they take a bath or a shower. Not uncommon for it to be weepy or pussy, where it just doesn't make sense. It almost looks like a wound in particular. It can be itchy. We know that mold and fungus increases the production of histamine and mast cells underneath the surface of the skin. And so it makes kids really itchy, where they then are itching at these eczema wounds, and then they're creating a risk for topical infection. Mm-hmm. So not uncommon to see then staph infections on the skin that do need to be addressed. But the patches for fungal infections are typically circular in nature. Sometimes they will dry out and get more flaky. And the number one thing that we see parents doing as they try to go towards more natural routes is they'll put something like coconut oil or tallow on the eczema, and it actually makes it worse. And it just is very confusing because it's like, I picked a natural option. I thought this would make it better, and it makes it worse. Mm-hmm. And that tells us that it's a fungal issue because fungus requires moisture to thrive. And so when you put this really heavy moisture barrier on it, we give it what it needs. And so it's able to grow and it gets so much worse. So those are what we're looking for. And if I'm seeing those, I always want to, at the bare minimum, be ruling out mycotoxins. Not uncommon that does come up, but it's possible that it could just be a candida issue in the gut. Sometimes kids are exposed to antibiotics during labor or birth, or they have health issues early in childhood where they're prescribed antibiotics. And we know that antibiotics, when they kill beneficial bacteria, just allow for normal yeast in the gut to overgrow. And that can start to cause issues that then come out through the skin.
Is there anything topical that you do suggest to these for fungal eczema?
Yep, absolutely. There's two things. The first one is hypochlorous spray. The brand that we typically use is Briotech. This is a great spray that you can spray on a couple times a day. And then the second one is from a company called Pure 03. We like their olive oil blend. This is ozonated olive oil. Now, this one is kind of hit or miss. It just depends on the child and what their tolerance is, because it does create a little bit of a moisture barrier. But both hypochlorous spray and ozonated oil are ultimately broad spectrum antimicrobials, meaning that they do work on fungus and they work on bacteria. So it can be really supportive. But one of the things that we're often thinking about with fungal eczemas is we actually want to dry them out, which is what parents are often so scared to do, is we have to let it dry in order to heal. And then it's a little tricky because as the skin heals, it can also be itchy. So if you've ever skinned your knee or your elbow or something, as it starts to heal, it gets itchy and there's that temptation to itch it. It can look like it's still a histamine issue, but it just tells us the skin is actually healing.
Yeah. I was also wondering about aloe. Is aloe something that's good for fungal eczema?
Yeah, aloe can be great because it does actually dry really quickly and gets absorbed through the skin relatively quickly. So it's not uncommon for us to see somebody do something like hypochlorous spray to dry things out, let it dry fully, soak in, and then later in the day put something like aloe on.
Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, well, we're going to move on to some questions that we got. And the first one is there an approximate time length for antimicrobial or antifungal phases with a toddler with past mold exposure and eczema, or best to pulse on and off?
Great question. It's really going to depend on the severity. So if there's a lot of fungal issues or a lot of mycotoxins in particular, it can take some time. So I would say most of the kids that we're working with are doing antifungals for between 8 and 12 weeks, depending on the severity. Not uncommon for us to need an additional 4 to 6 weeks with kids where there is a very significant burden. And the thing to keep in mind, rather than pulsing on and off, we don't typically pulse on and off with kids, but we do need to rotate in particular. So not doing the same thing for those full 8 to 12 weeks. Changing the antimicrobials or antifungals is incredibly helpful, because what you'll often find is that kids react very well to some and then not so well to others. And essentially kind of what we're trying to do ultimately with fungus or bacteria is kind of catch it off guard at the end of the day and make sure that we're getting everything by using different antifungals and antimicrobial agents or herbs to make sure that we're getting everything that is there.
Okay. That's great. I mean, what's a typical course of antifungals, in terms of time length?
Yeah. So I would say in terms of the antifungal specifically, it would be 8 to 12 weeks. But in terms of total protocol, when we're writing it for kids, is typically in the ballpark of 3 to 5 months, depending on the child. When we're working with families, we work with them in 6-month containers, just because we know that things happen with kids. Sometimes they get sick. They don't want to do things. You go on vacation, they have a birthday, whatever it is. And so we like to have some flexibility with parents, but there tends to be a little bit longer of a duration. And this is going to be dependent also on what's coming up in terms of pathogen burden. Are there also bacterial overgrowths? Are we seeing if there are parasites? Because we don't want to address everything at the same time. It's very important to have some strategy and bring things in slowly for kids, just because they are sensitive and we want to know if they're having an adverse reaction to anything. One of the ways that we often kind of frame this for parents is we want to make sure that we're not making things worse before they get better. We really want to get things stabilized so that we can address these deeper issues without flaring a child in the process.
Okay. That's great. So what best detects mold in a child's environment? I think we kind of went over this, but this person asked ERMI or the total tox test, but those are one's environmental and one's for the body. So
Yep. So I would say a total tox test, or even just doing a mycotoxin urine test, you're testing the body to figure out what's happening there. That's going to tell you whether there has ever been an exposure. So for kids, keep in mind this can be a current exposure in their living environment. It could be a past exposure, or it could be transferred in utero from mom. So there's kind of three scenarios worth exploring there. And then the ERMI, or if we're thinking about something like an EMA, a dust test, plate testing, things like that, that's more testing the actual current environment to determine if what you're seeing on mycotoxin testing lines up with what is currently being exposed.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So I think what Deidre is saying is like, you just need to make sure that when you're looking at the environment, you're using environmental testing versus the body. Mm-hmm. Okay. So depending on the age of the child, do you recommend urine mycotoxin testing for both? We kind of already addressed this for both mom and child to see how much of mom's terrain is impacting or impacted the child's tox results. Does that depend on the age, really, of the child?
Not necessarily. I mean, not necessarily. I think only if there's like if there was a significant burden where like we're not seeing kids get better, which I've never personally seen, by addressing just the child, and then more like functional supports for mom. So think like the way that we're digesting food, supporting regular bowel movements, things like that. As long as those things are in place, I've never seen it be an issue where the child can't get better, particularly in the terms of like breastfeeding is how we were talking about it. But with older children, you could certainly, I know moms are always curious to figure out like, did this come from me sort of thing. That can be helpful at that point in time, but not while breastfeeding.
Yeah. And probably while the child is getting better, just like the whole nervous system thing, the moms probably get better by osmosis.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Okay. That one we kind of already, how do you get mold out of the sinus? We kind of addressed that already, so we can skip over that one. How do you differentiate a chronic mold exposure, like in the house, versus a short-term mold exposure, like a previous hotel stay? How long do the toxins stay in the body?
Great question. So they can stay in the body for years, I would argue decades. It just depends on the person and their inherent ability to detox, ultimately. We all have innate capacity to detox, but ultimately, because of the different ways that we're exposed to a number of different toxins in our modern culture, our detoxification gets impaired. So sometimes there is a stumbling block, which means that things start to build up and accumulate over time. And it can take a lot of time for you to start to develop symptoms. So for instance, sometimes we'll see where there's an exposure that happened years and years ago where we felt fine in the process of the exposure, but then slowly things have started to get worse. And ultimately what we're thinking about there is that the mold has colonized the body. It's producing more and more toxins. It's growing stronger and producing more fungal overgrowth ultimately. And so the symptoms will get worse and worse. I know a lot of times this happens to me too when traveling. Like we've all stayed in a hotel where there's very obvious mold. Mm-hmm. I've never really thought or seen anybody who got sick off of a single mold exposure in a short-term environmental stay. Because it does take some time ultimately for these things to colonize the body. It's typically more of a long-term exposure, like living in a home, even if it's like 6 months in a home. It's certainly possible where people will go into a home where they say, I moved into this apartment and like I felt really sick within like a number of months. I usually look back a year to 2 years. If somebody says, oh, I moved into this house 2 years ago, but they have signs of mold issues, that's where I'm starting to think about like, this could just be something that's slowly been building ultimately. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the only way to know if it's something that's current is to test your home or rule that out, which is the way to approach that mentally to approach that is like, let's rule this out as a current issue. And if it's not here, then we know that it's an old exposure.
Yeah. And I guess I know enough to be dangerous as far as testing it is concerned, but I do know there are certain mycotoxins that when they appear like on a total tox, they could be more indicative of something like a candida overgrowth versus like environmental. So I know that working with a practitioner is probably always the best, and the best route.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And the other thing to consider too is that there's food-based mycotoxins too, because of the way that like grains are stored, and dairy inherently carries mycotoxins. And so sometimes these are coming from food exposures. Sometimes they're like long-term food exposures. So like one of the ones that we commonly see is something called zearalenone, and it comes from rice and oats and grains and things like that. And it has a whole host of effects, but it could be something that you're currently eating, or it could be something that you leaned on for a period of time in the past that has just kind of built up in the body.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up because we didn't address that. But in terms of mycotoxins in foods, when you're treating like a child, like the one in your case study, do you automatically kind of eliminate high mycotoxin foods during sort of the treatment, or do you kind of, is that a case by case type thing?
Yeah, it is case by case. I would say when we do see that there's a pretty significant fungal issue, there's two top foods that we often recommend removing or at least reducing very significantly. The first one is going to be gluten, just because we know that wheat is a huge carrier of mycotoxins. It also carries a lot of things like pesticides on it. And so removing that can be incredibly helpful, combined with the fact that we know that the protein gliadin in gluten is inherently going to cause leaky gut. So even though the goal may not be to remove gluten forever, if we remove that during the gut healing protocol, it just allows for one less factor to be causing that intestinal permeability so that we can heal and seal the gut, with the goal for many parents of reintroducing that in the future. So that's the first one. The second one is dairy. And the reason that we remove dairy when we see a fungal issue is we know that dairy is a carrier of a lot of mycotoxins, regardless of quality. So even like if you're doing A2A2 or raw milk, you can still have mycotoxins there. And so we want to remove that. We also know that dairy can just ultimately irritate the gut lining. And so the same is true. We want to remove those big factors that can be irritating so that we can get things in a much better spot, again, with the goal of reintroducing that. And that's true of all food sensitivities. With a lot of children, we do see allergies go away as well. And so we'll have children come in where they have IgE testing when they come in. They say, you know, I'm allergic to eggs, for instance. And we'll go through gut healing, do detoxification, especially of mold. We see a lot of mold issues with food allergies. And then we will have them go back, get IgE tested again, and the allergies have gone away. And we can start to strategically reintroduce those foods.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy, because it kind of takes one more thing off the table while you're trying to get them better. So,
absolutely.
Okay, well, we're going to start going through some of the audience questions. Let's see. Someone was asking about our test plates and that they expired a year ago. No, if they've expired, we don't suggest you use them because the results are not going to be accurate. So just get in touch with us and maybe we can replace them depending on your order. Okay, this one is same question. How do you test your child for mold? I think we went through that, the GI map and the total tox were
it'll be any type of urinalysis that tests for mycotoxins is what you're looking for to test the child specifically.
Okay, and the one you used was Vibrant, right?
Yep, I use the Vibrant one.
Okay. Let's see. Where or how do you get the urine test to test for mold exposure?
Great question. You're often going to need to be working with some level of a functional practitioner in order to order this. It's unfortunately not something that a lot of pediatricians or conventional doctors know exists or acknowledge that mold illness is something that is real, even though it's becoming a lot more common and prevalent and people know about it. So working with a functional practitioner, this is something that we do if that's helpful. A lot of times we can order testing and just go through it on like a one-off lab review with you to see what's there if this is something you're concerned about prior to committing to like doing a protocol with our team in any way. So it can give you a great screening tool. I know there's a lot of providers that do this as a service just so that you can test to determine if this is truly the issue for your family.
Okay. And this is sort of a follow-up question, kind of the same. What is the recommended test for mycotoxins and what is the official lab name? I think there's more than one lab.
Yep, absolutely. So There's two big ones. So the first one is you're going to want to ask for mycotoxins specifically. Vibrant Wellness or Vibrant America, they're the same company, does this. That's the one that I use because they have 29 different mycotoxins. And on a cost perspective, it's more effective, more affordable to do it that way. And you get a lot more data. The other option is a company called Mosaic. They're formerly Great Plains Labs, and it's also a urine test, and it's going to be their mycotoxins test as well. The total tox is the one that I do for kids only because I want to see what's happening with heavy metals and chemicals, but you can also get that exact same test in just mycotoxins only.
Okay, that's great. Okay, this question is, what do you suggest for constipation?
Great question. Okay, so we don't recommend Miralax. And the reason is, you look surprised.
Yeah, no. Although that's usually the first thing the pediatrician recommends.
Yes.
So.
Yes. So we don't recommend Miralax because it's not actually considered safe for children and it's not intended for long-term use. And so we do see a lot of pediatricians, unfortunately, recommending this, especially for stubborn constipation for children, without an end goal, right? Miralax can be something that may be useful on a short-term basis, like some out of the ordinary constipation. But we know that it has the ability to change neurological function. The gut and the brain are intimately connected. And so anytime there's inflammation happening in the GI tract, we know that there's also going to be inflammation in the brain, which is why we can see a lot of neurological issues with kids. In the article, I talked about that crashing and head banging. Those are the type of behavioral things that indicate to me that the brain is inflamed. And so we're looking more at the gut. So the way that I typically approach constipation is much more natural and gentle. Two of our favorite ways to do that, BioRay is a company that's designed for children actually, and they have a product called NDF Pooper. Super safe. The dosage is provided on the bottle. It's based on the child's weight. And then the other one that I recommend is a magnesium oxide. So magnesium oxide is a little bit different than magnesium citrate, which is what people are typically familiar with. Magnesium citrate is a laxative, but what it does is it changes the osmotic pressure in the colon. And so it means that water is not reabsorbed in the large intestine, which can cause diarrhea. But with kids, there's a greater risk for dehydration. And so we don't want to do that. We don't want to give them watery diarrhea. What we do instead is that magnesium oxide, which has the same impact for motility to move the bowels, but it doesn't change that osmotic pressure. So kids can actually retain the water. So that is a really great support. It's very gentle. It doesn't taste like anything either. So you can put it in things like their juice. You can put it directly in their mouth and they tolerate it very well. The only thing is we want to go really low and slow with that in terms of dosage. So like a lot of kids don't need more than a half a capsule, regardless of their age or weight by any means. Just like a pinch goes a long way for kids, and then increase slowly if needed.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Thoughts on oral expanders for children who have gone through multiple protocols but still struggle with low immunity, disrupted sleep, etc., and have dental crowding. Should this be considered later?
Great question. So I do think that thinking about structural things and like the mechanisms of the sinuses in the mouth really does go hand in hand with what we're thinking as far as toxin burden. So I would always be ruling out something like mold and mycotoxin illness with the low immunity, the disrupted sleep, the crowding of the teeth as well. That's all. The crowding of the teeth is really thinking back to what we were talking about, bone remodeling and bone health and the way that the palate in the mouth forms. But we know that mold and mycotoxins are immunotoxic, meaning that they compromise the immune system. So not uncommon that we'll see children in particular where they get sick all the time or they get taken down by every illness that they get, particularly through the winter months when we're spending more time indoors, where there is often more mold in buildings, even schools, daycares, things like that. And then even the disrupted sleep. Not uncommon that we'll see disrupted sleep with kids if there is a mold issue just because they are fungus is a little bit more active at night. It produces more histamine in the evenings as well. So we can see some disrupted sleep where they're having trouble. But the oral expanders can be incredibly helpful. It might be necessary alongside a mold protocol. It's just going to depend on the child and I think the severity of it, especially if they're waking up at night. Even if they are going through a mold protocol and they're having trouble breathing at night, that's going to be very difficult for them to detox, especially the brain, it happens primarily at night. So it might need to happen in conjunction.
Okay. Let's see. What is the mycotoxin on rice called again?
It's zearalenone. So it's short term is ZEA or ZEN. You can find a lot of info on it.
What do you know what mold produces that mycotoxin? I don't know that right off the top of my head.
I believe it's a Fusarium mold.
Okay.
Can produce that as well.
Okay. Which is very common in grains and things like that. Okay. Yep. In your experience, how toxic can cladosporium spores and their mycotoxins be to children or adults?
They definitely can be. It depends on the person. And I think the thing to keep in mind oftentimes is that children are often the canary in the family when there is something happening in the home, because their bodies are so much smaller than ours, they get toxic faster. And so we'll start to see impacts with kids first, but it can impact everybody differently. So for instance, when we see children come in and there is a mold issue, and then we figure out that it is in the house, or as we're trying to figure out if it's in the house, a lot of times parents can feel like, but I'm not sick, or my partner's not sick, so maybe there's not something going on here. Everybody responds to mold differently at the end of the day. So even if there are, let's say, twins, we see a lot of twins, and one is really sick and one has a different presentation. It's just due to their unique genetic makeup and the way that they uniquely have experienced the world. Different stressors on their body, how they perceive the world, can change how these different types of spores can impact them.
Okay. And Francisco, for whatever it's worth, cladosporium was sort of like one of the higher molds in our house when we had a mold issue. And it definitely impacted both myself and my kids a lot. So, I mean, I know it can definitely make you sick if you're susceptible to it. So,
Yep.
It's less the mold, I think, than I guess the level of exposure or the mycotoxins. One last question, and this was something we had a live last week, and we talked a lot about like mental health. And one of the pieces of that was disordered eating behavior. And I was wondering from a parent perspective, how much you see mycotoxins impact disordered eating behaviors in children, like
Absolutely.
food aversions, things like that.
Picky eating is a really big one. Yep. We see a ton of picky eating with kids who have mold. And so the way that we think about this is kind of twofold. One, we know that mold changes the way that the immune system functions, and children are incredibly intuitive. So we'll start to see kids where they will lean away from foods where they know that the immune system is unable to withstand them. And so that's one way we can start to see them be very picky. They're pick foods that they know are safe, that don't really make a whole lot of sense to us as adults. But the other thing is we can see these biochemical changes as well. So we know that mold can change the way that the GI tract works, how fast motility moves, but it can also change digestive capacity. So if it's impacting the liver and its ability to produce bile, kids might lean away from fat-rich foods. If it's impacting stomach acid, then they might lean away from protein-rich foods. And so when we're thinking about picky eating in particular, we want to make sure that kids have support where they need it from the ability to actually chemically digest food as well. Because if they don't, it just means that it's likely going to hurt their stomach. They lean away from it. They don't want to do that again. Kids are so smart. They know a lot about what's happening in their body. So when we support both sides of that and think about removing the mold from their body as well, it makes a huge difference in the way that they are able to select foods. And it's not uncommon that we'll see huge doors open in terms of the food that they then are able to enjoy and actually want to eat.
Okay. Well, that leads me to one last question as far as that is concerned. But do you bring digestive enzymes on with children ever?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, we'll do a lot of chewable digestive enzymes with kids. And the nice thing with chewable digestive enzymes is they tend to have sucrose in them, so they taste like candy for kids. They're like one of the easiest things for us to have kids do because they feel like they're getting a treat at their meals, and they can be really helpful, especially when we see kids with really bad abdominal distension, if we're noticing a lot of bloating or gas, and especially if they have a lot of undigested food in their stool.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, and then I think this is our last question. My kids eat a lot of frozen fruit, i.e. blueberries, mango, cherries. Any concern for mold exposure with frozen or fresh fruits ingested?
As long as they're frozen or fresh, I don't have a ton of huge concerns. The ones where I do have concerns with fruit is dried fruits, just because of the way that it's stored and there's moisture. But with frozen fruits and fresh, not usually a big issue.
Okay. Recommend, you can use our Citra drops like to wash food and stuff with. Is there like a wash that you ever recommend to parents?
I usually recommend like an ozone bubbler. Actually, you can put produce in water, do an ozone bubbler. It cleans produce, even if it's organic. I do that just to make sure that anything that's on there, we can kill it.
Great. Okay. What's the name of the chewable digestive enzyme?
The one that we recommend the most, I believe, is by Therabiotic, and it's it's for adults technically, but it's a chewable enzyme.
Okay. Well, I think that's the last of our questions, and that basically hits us at an hour. So I know you've got to get back to your practice, but we so appreciate it. And if you want to find Deidre and how to work with her website is always-growing.com. And she's on IG at alwaysgrowing_littles. And we'll put all that stuff and the caption and everything from today. And then her article is linked, and there's further link finder from her. But anyway, I think that concludes for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.